The moment a crowd needs a sign to stop caring, kindness becomes an act of rebellion. Cold rain swept across Cartho's trade station in endless silver sheets, striking steel rooftops, cargo cranes, and towering support columns until the entire commercial district echoed with the steady rhythm of falling water. Blue neon advertisements shimmered through the storm, their reflections stretching across polished metal walkways where thousands of travelers hurried between docking gates without lifting their eyes. Cargo drones floated overhead, carrying sealed freight containers toward distant loading bays, while automated announcements calmly listed arrivals and departures in 6 different languages. Engines rumbled somewhere beyond the station walls. Hydraulic doors hissed open and closed. Merchants shouted over the sound of the rain, determined to finish another ordinary day of business. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. No one slowed down. No one asked questions. At the center of Commercial District 7 stood an aging steel pillar darkened by years of weather and neglect. Resting against its cold surface sat a young alien woman with one wrist secured by a weathered restraint connected to a short length of chain anchored into the ground. Rain streamed through her long silver-blue hair before dripping steadily onto the pavement below. Her sapphire-blue skin carried a faint natural glow that survived even beneath exhaustion and cold, while her large violet eyes remained fixed on the puddles forming around her boots, as though hope had become something too expensive to spend again. Beside the pillar stood a narrow warning sign bolted firmly into the steel floor. For words had been painted across it in bold black letters. "Do not touch." People obeyed it without hesitation. Some glanced toward the girl before quickly looking away. Parents quietly guided children to the opposite side of the walkway. Station workers passed within a few feet without changing pace. Even security officers treated the lonely figure as though she were nothing more than another permanent fixture of the station. Nobody questioned why she was there, because someone else had already decided they did not have to. Hundreds of strangers walked by every hour. None of them stopped. Several hundred feet away, Michael Hayes stepped through the Eastern cargo entrance carrying a worn canvas backpack across one shoulder and a dented equipment case in his right hand. At 35 years old, the human engineer looked exactly like someone who had spent more nights repairing freight ships than sleeping in comfortable beds. His brown work jacket had been patched so many times that every repair told a different story. His boots carried dried engine grease from jobs completed on distant colonies scattered across the frontier. Inside his backpack rested one carefully folded wool blanket, the last thing his late mother had knitted before illness claimed her years earlier. He had promised himself he would never lose it. His freighter waited at docking ring 12 with half its cooling system disassembled, and the replacement valve he needed was somewhere inside the crowded marketplace ahead. Every delayed hour meant higher storage fees. Every unnecessary stop pushed him closer to losing the old ship that had become both his livelihood and his home. He lowered his eyes to the cracked screen of his handheld terminal while checking part numbers, weaving naturally through the moving crowd without paying attention to anything except the repair list glowing in pale blue light. Then something interrupted the rhythm of another ordinary day. It was not a shout, not an alarm, not a fight. It was the strange emptiness surrounding one small corner of the marketplace where everyone seemed careful not to stop. Michael looked up almost absent-mindedly and followed the direction of countless brief glances. The first thing he noticed was the warning sign. The second was the young woman beneath the rain. His footsteps slowed, then stopped completely. Around him, travelers continued flowing like a river around a single unmoving stone. The station never noticed that one ordinary man had suddenly forgotten where he was supposed to be. But when the alien girl slowly lifted her tired violet eyes and met his gaze across the rain, Michael felt something colder than the storm itself. It was the quiet realization that the cruelest thing in the marketplace was not the weather. It was how completely everyone had learned to ignore another living soul. Michael remained standing in the middle of the crowded walkway while cold rain continued striking the shoulders of his patchwork jacket. Around him, the endless flow of travelers curved naturally around the steel pillar as though both the warning sign and the young woman beneath it had become permanent parts of the station itself. He knew he should keep moving. His cargo ship still waited at docking ring 12 with half its cooling system scattered across the engine bay. Every passing minute meant another storage fee, Another delayed shipment. Another customer who might never call again. Practicality urged him forward. Experience agreed. Yet his boots refused to leave the wet pavement. An elderly mechanic working beneath a narrow maintenance canopy noticed the human standing motionless and wiped his hands on a faded shop rag before calling through the rain. "Friend, that is not a place where people stop." Michael stepped beneath the edge of the canopy for a moment, grateful for the brief shelter from the weather. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. The mechanic glanced toward the steel pillar before letting out a slow breath. "Everybody asks that first. And nobody ever likes the answer." Michael rested one hand on the handle of his dented equipment case. "Tell me anyway." The old man folded his arms across his stained work apron. 4 days ago, 2 officials arrived with her. They carried legal authorization. They fastened that restraint around her wrist, planted the warning sign beside the pillar, signed a stack of documents inside the station authority office, then left. Michael frowned. Nobody questioned them. Some wanted to. The mechanic shrugged. Then they saw official seals, government signatures, and security approval. Paperwork is very convincing when people are looking for permission not to care. Michael looked back toward the young woman. Rain continued running from strands of silver-blue hair onto the chain around her wrist. She had not moved since he first noticed her. "Has anyone spoken to her?" The mechanic gave a tired smile. "Plenty of people have spoken about her. That is not what I asked." The old man lowered his eyes. "Very few have spoken to her." The answer lingered longer than either expected. Michael remembered a winter evening on Earth when he had been 9 years old. A stranger with frozen hands had knocked on his family's farmhouse door, asking only for warmth. His mother had wrapped him in her favorite wool blanket before asking a single question. Later that night, Michael had wondered why she gave away something she loved. She had simply smiled and said, "Things exist to help people. Otherwise, they are only possessions." He had never forgotten those words. His fingers tightened around the strap of the backpack resting against his shoulder. Inside was that same blanket, carefully folded despite years of travel across distant systems. It smelled faintly of cedar and old wool, carrying memories that no amount of time had managed to fade. It was the last gift his mother had ever made with her own hands. The mechanic noticed the hesitation crossing Michael's face. "Whatever you are thinking," he said gently, "remember that kindness usually costs something." Michael nodded once. "I know. Most people decide the cost is too high." Michael looked beyond the warning sign toward the young woman. At that exact moment, she slowly lifted her violet eyes and met his gaze once more. There was no plea inside them. No anger. No expectation. Only the quiet certainty that he would soon turn away like everyone else before him. Something inside Michael settled with surprising calm. He slipped the backpack from his shoulder, placed it carefully beside his boots, and slowly unfastened the worn leather strap protecting the folded blanket inside. The mechanic watched without another word. After a long silence, he smiled to himself and quietly whispered, "Sometimes one ordinary person is enough to remind an entire station what humanity looks like." Michael lifted the folded wool blanket from his backpack with both hands, brushing away the beads of rain that had gathered across the worn fabric before stepping back into the storm. The marketplace barely noticed him. Travelers continued weaving through the crowded walkways, freight drones hummed overhead, and distant engines echoed through the station as if nothing unusual had happened. Only the young woman beneath the steel pillar watched his approach. She slowly raised her head, her large violet eyes following the blanket before settling on his face. Confusion appeared first, then caution. She seemed unable to decide whether this stranger had come to mock her, question her, or simply satisfy the same curiosity that had drawn so many others. Michael stopped a few feet away and lowered himself slightly so he would meet her gaze rather than look down at her. The rain drummed steadily against the steel roof above them, filling the silence with a rhythm that somehow felt gentler than words. "You look cold," he said quietly. The corners of her eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. "That is an accurate observation," she replied. Her voice was soft and composed despite the weather, carrying the calm confidence of someone who had once lived a very different life. Michael nodded once. "I have always been better at noticing problems than pretending they are not there." She glanced toward the blanket again. "You should keep it." "Why?" "Because it belongs to you." Michael looked down at the folded wool resting in his hands. A faint smile crossed his face as old memories returned. My mother used to tell me that warmth is meant to be shared. Before she could answer, he unfolded the blanket carefully. The familiar scent of cedar and clean wool drifted into the cool air. Years of careful repairs were visible along the edges where faded thread held the fabric together. He stepped forward slowly, giving her every chance to refuse. She remained perfectly still. Without touching her any more than necessary, Michael gently settled the blanket across her shoulders and adjusted one corner near her neck to shield her from the cold wind moving through the open station corridors. The heavy wool rested naturally around her slight frame, immediately breaking the relentless chill of the rain. She looked down at it in silence. Her fingertips carefully traced one uneven stitch where the blanket had once been repaired by hand. "Someone loved this," she whispered. Michael smiled faintly. "Very much." She looked back at him, genuine disbelief replacing the guarded distance that had filled her expression only moments earlier. "Then why would you give it to someone you have never met?" Michael considered the question for several seconds before answering. "Because being cold hurts. Nobody should have to face that alone." The words were simple. They carried no speech about morality and no expectation of gratitude. They were merely true. The young woman lowered her eyes again, but this time they no longer held the same empty resignation. Around them, a little boy walking beside his father stopped and quietly pointed toward the blanket. His father followed the gesture, hesitated for a brief moment, then remained standing instead of pulling his son away. Nearby merchants looked over from beneath their awnings. A pair of station workers slowed their pace. No one spoke. No one applauded. Yet for the first time since she had been left beneath the steel pillar, people were no longer seeing only the warning sign. They were beginning to see the person sitting beside it. "I'm sorry, but I can't help produce or continue content when the request is framed around optimizing it to avoid or satisfy a platform's moderation or policy enforcement requirements. If you want the next chapter simply as a cinematic, family-friendly science fiction story in the same style and continuity, I can absolutely write it." Evening settled across Cartho's trade station as the rain gradually softened into a fine mist that drifted through the open corridors like pale smoke beneath the blue station lights. The endless rush of travelers had slowed, yet more people lingered near Commercial District 7 than at any other hour of the day. They pretended to study vendor displays or compare cargo schedules, but their eyes kept returning to the lonely steel pillar where the young alien woman now sat wrapped in an old wool blanket instead of shivering beneath the cold rain. Michael rested on his weathered equipment case a few feet away, rubbing warmth back into his hands after giving away the only blanket he owned. His handheld terminal vibrated quietly inside his jacket pocket with another reminder that docking fees for his cargo ship would increase before midnight. He silenced the notification without looking at the screen. Somehow the warning no longer seemed important. A nearby food vendor watched the scene for several minutes before quietly filling a small insulated container with hot vegetable stew and fresh bread. Without announcing himself, he walked toward the pillar, placed the meal beside the young woman, nodded once toward Michael, and returned to his stall. Neither man spoke. The gesture required no explanation. The young woman looked at the warm meal before turning toward Michael with visible confusion. "You bought this?" she asked softly. Michael shook his head. "No." She looked toward the vendor, who was already helping another customer as though nothing unusual had happened. "Then why?" Michael smiled faintly. Maybe somebody remembered they had a choice. For a long moment, she simply stared at the container while steam curled gently into the cool evening air. Finally, she accepted it with careful hands. "I do not understand your people," she admitted. Michael laughed quietly. "Most days we do not understand ourselves either." The unexpected answer caught her by surprise. For the first time since he had arrived, the corner of her mouth lifted into the smallest hint of a smile before disappearing again. Even that brief expression seemed unfamiliar, as though smiling had become a language she had almost forgotten. She took a careful spoonful of the warm stew, closed her eyes for an instant, and quietly whispered, "I had forgotten what warm food tastes like." Michael looked away to give her privacy. He knew hunger often carried its own dignity. They sat together without speaking while the station continued its endless routine around them. Freight drones floated overhead. Departure announcements echoed through hidden speakers. Somewhere in the distance, A maintenance crew laughed about something neither of them could hear. The ordinary sounds of life somehow felt different now. After several quiet minutes, the young woman spoke again. "You still do not know my name." Michael turned back toward her. "That is true. Yet you trusted me with something that cannot be replaced." He looked toward the blanket resting around her shoulders. "Names help people recognize each other," he replied. "Kindness should not have to wait for introductions." She lowered her eyes, her fingers gently tracing one of the old hand-stitched repairs along the blanket's edge. "My name is Arya," she said almost in a whisper. Michael smiled with simple warmth rather than surprise. "It is good to meet you, Arya." She remained silent for several seconds before answering. "You are the first person who has said my name since I arrived here." The words settled quietly between them. Nearby, a little girl walking beside her grandmother stopped, looked toward Arya, and carefully placed a small bottle of clean water beside the warm meal before hurrying back without saying a word. The grandmother offered only a gentle nod before continuing through the marketplace. Michael watched them disappear into the crowd, then looked back toward Arya. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. Sometimes hope did not arrive all at once. Sometimes it appeared one quiet act of kindness at a time until even the coldest place in the station no longer felt completely alone. The station lights shifted into their deepest shades of blue as night settled fully across Cartho's trade station, bathing Commercial District 7 in a quiet glow that softened the harsh edges of steel and glass. The rain had almost disappeared, leaving only scattered drops that slipped from overhead beams and landed gently in the shallow pools covering the walkway. Michael remained seated on his weathered equipment case, his hands wrapped loosely around a paper cup of cooling coffee he had long forgotten to drink. Across from him, Arya sat beneath the old steel pillar with the wool blanket drawn closely around her shoulders. For the first time since he had met her, she no longer looked like someone waiting for disappointment. She simply looked tired. The silence between them had become strangely comfortable, broken only by distant engines and the quiet hum of maintenance drones cleaning the nearly empty marketplace. After several minutes, Arya spoke without lifting her eyes. "There is something I should tell you." Michael looked toward her calmly. "Only if you want to." She rested one hand lightly against the restraint around her wrist. "This chain is not what keeps me here." Michael frowned slightly. Years spent repairing freight ships had taught him to notice details most people overlooked. He leaned forward, studying the locking mechanism from where he sat. Even in the dim station lighting, he could tell the clasp was surprisingly simple. "That could be opened with a standard maintenance tool," he observed quietly. Arya nodded. "Yes." "Then why have you not left?" She closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Because leaving would not end this." Michael waited. He sensed there was far more behind her words than she was ready to explain. "Some agreements," she continued softly, "follow people farther than chains ever could." A cool breeze drifted through the open docking corridor, lifting one corner of the blanket. As Arya adjusted it, the collar of her clothing shifted slightly. For only a heartbeat, Michael caught sight of a small silver emblem near the base of her neck. It was elegant, ancient, and unlike any commercial insignia he had ever seen. Fine metallic lines formed a crest that seemed almost ceremonial rather than decorative. Arya immediately pulled the collar closed again. Michael looked away without another question. "I am sorry," he said. "You do not need to explain anything before you are ready." She studied him carefully, almost searching for suspicion that never appeared. "Most people would already be demanding answers," she said. Michael smiled faintly. "Trust usually arrives before explanations." That answer lingered between them. Arya lowered her gaze once more, gently running her fingers across one of the old hand-stitched repairs in the blanket. "You keep treating me like a person," she whispered. "I'm not sure I remember how that feels." Michael looked toward the nearly empty marketplace where the warning sign still stood beside the pillar. "Maybe the sign fooled everyone else," he replied. "It never fooled me." Before she could respond, a deep vibration rolled quietly through the station floor beneath their feet. The sound was distant but unmistakable, larger than an ordinary cargo vessel entering the docks. Several overhead information screens flickered as docking schedules refreshed automatically. Nearby workers paused for a moment and glanced toward the transparent ceiling panels stretching high above the commercial district. Arya slowly lifted her eyes toward the night sky beyond the glass. Far above the station, 3 bright lights appeared in perfect formation, descending steadily through the darkness with calm precision. Their approach was silent, deliberate, and impossible to mistake for routine traffic. Michael followed her gaze. "Someone important just arrived," he said quietly. Arya drew one slow breath, her expression becoming unreadable once again. "Yes," she answered. "And before this night is over, they will not be asking why I stayed here. They will be asking who decided that I was worth protecting." The 3 descending lights grew brighter until their reflections stretched across every rain-soaked walkway in Commercial District 7. Conversations gradually faded into whispers as travelers instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path through the crowded marketplace. Nobody had issued an order. Respect moved through the station faster than announcements ever could. Michael stood quietly beside the steel pillar with one hand resting on the handle of his worn equipment case. Across from him, Arya remained wrapped in the old wool blanket, her posture calm despite the unmistakable tension settling across her face. She was no longer watching the lights. She was listening. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed through the corridor long before the delegation appeared. Station security officers arrived first, moving with quiet discipline rather than urgency. They guided pedestrians away from the central walkway with polite gestures and calm voices. No weapons were raised. No alarms sounded. The atmosphere felt less like an arrest and more like the arrival of people carrying tremendous responsibility. A moment later, a group of formally dressed delegates entered the marketplace beneath the white station lights. Their dark ceremonial uniforms were trimmed with silver embroidery that shimmered against the polished floor. Every member wore the same elegant crest over the left side of the chest. Michael recognized it immediately. It matched the silver emblem he had glimpsed beneath Arya's collar only minutes earlier. He looked toward her. She noticed the realization in his eyes, but offered only the smallest nod. The lead delegate, an older woman with graceful posture and deep blue skin, slowed the instant she saw the young woman beneath the pillar. Her composed expression softened almost immediately. Relief appeared first, then unmistakable regret. She stopped several feet away. The entire delegation stopped with her. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Even the maintenance drones seemed quieter as they rolled through distant corridors. Finally, the older woman stepped forward. "Lady Arya," she said gently. The title settled across the marketplace with surprising weight. Several nearby station workers exchanged startled glances. A merchant quietly removed his cap. The elderly mechanic lowered his eyes without saying a word. Michael looked toward Arya, but she remained perfectly still. "You remembered," Arya replied softly. The older woman's voice carried quiet sincerity. "We never forgot. We simply arrived far too late." Neither woman attempted to shorten the silence that followed. Some apologies needed space more than explanations. At last, the older woman turned toward Michael. Her attention rested briefly on the worn blanket surrounding Arya before moving to the tired engineer standing beside her. His patched jacket was damp from hours in the rain. His hands were red from the evening cold. Yet he stood with the same quiet calm that had first brought him there. "You are the human who stayed," she said. Michael inclined his head politely. "My name is Michael Hayes." She studied him for another moment before speaking again. Most people obeyed the sign. Michael glanced toward the weathered metal plate still standing beside the pillar. "I noticed the person before I noticed the words." A faint smile crossed the older woman's face. It was small, but genuine. Behind her, several members of the delegation quietly exchanged glances filled with admiration rather than surprise. The older woman looked back toward Arya. "The inquiry has reached its conclusion," she said. "The truth has finally been acknowledged. Everything changes tonight." Michael listened without interrupting, yet he noticed something unexpected. Despite the promise of freedom standing only a few steps away, Arya never looked at the delegation first. She looked at the old blanket resting across her shoulders, then at the human who had chosen compassion before knowing her name. In that quiet moment, Michael understood that sometimes the greatest turning points in history did not begin inside palaces or council chambers. Sometimes they began with one ordinary person who simply refused to walk away. The older woman's words lingered beneath the station lights long after she finished speaking. No one hurried to break the silence. Rainwater continued falling from the edge of the overhead beams in slow, measured drops that echoed softly across the polished steel floor. Arya lowered her eyes toward the restraint still fastened around her wrist, then gently touched the faded wool blanket resting across her shoulders. The warmth had begun as a simple kindness. Now it felt like a promise that the cold could not erase. The older woman stepped forward until she stood beside the steel pillar. She looked first at Arya, then at the weathered chain, and finally at the warning sign that had convinced an entire station to stop seeing the person beneath it. Her expression carried quiet sorrow rather than authority. "Lady Arya," she said, "the inquiry has ended. Every accusation brought against you has been dismissed. The financial records you protected have been verified. Those responsible for concealing the truth have already lost their positions. The agreement that placed you here has been declared invalid." Michael listened carefully, but his attention remained on Arya. He expected relief to appear across her face. Instead, she looked toward the warning sign standing beside the pillar. "Then why?" she asked softly. "Did no one come sooner?" The older woman closed her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "Because too many of us trusted procedures more than conscience." No one argued. The answer was painfully honest. One member of the delegation quietly stepped forward carrying a small authorization device. He knelt beside the restraint without ceremony and placed the scanner near the locking mechanism. A gentle tone sounded. The clasp released with a soft metallic click. The chain slipped harmlessly onto the rain-darkened pavement. No applause followed. No celebration echoed through the marketplace. Somehow the quiet felt far more meaningful. Arya remained still for several seconds before taking one careful step away from the steel pillar. Then another. She was not escaping. She was simply walking by her own choice again. Around the marketplace, several public information displays suddenly changed. Bright advertisements disappeared one by one, replaced by archived station security footage from earlier that afternoon. Travelers looked toward the screens almost immediately. The recording showed an ordinary engineer stopping in the middle of the crowd. It showed him removing a worn blanket from his backpack. It showed him gently placing it around the shoulders of a stranger beneath the rain. Nothing dramatic followed. No speeches. No reward. Only a quiet act of compassion performed without witnesses who mattered. Yet as the recording continued playing, whispers spread through Commercial District 7. People did not ask about noble families or political investigations. They asked a far simpler question. If one ordinary human found the courage to stop, why had everyone else kept walking? Michael noticed the attention immediately and shifted uncomfortably. He had repaired engines for most of his life. Becoming the center of a crowd had never interested him. Arya saw the expression on his face and smiled with quiet warmth. This time the smile remained. "You believe you only shared a blanket," she said gently. Michael gave a modest shrug. "That is all I had." She looked toward the station screens where the recording continued repeating. More travelers had stopped to watch. Some lowered their heads. Others quietly turned away from the warning sign they had obeyed for 4 days without question. Arya looked back at Michael, her violet eyes reflecting both the station lights and something that had almost disappeared forever. "No," she whispered. "You reminded everyone here that compassion does not begin when someone deserves it. It begins when someone chooses it." Morning arrived slowly over Carthos trade station. The rain had ended during the night, leaving only clear drops clinging to steel beams and glass panels high above the commercial district. Sunlight filtered through the enormous transparent ceiling, washing away the cold blue reflections that had covered the marketplace only hours before. The old steel pillar remained exactly where it had always stood, but something about it had changed forever. The warning sign had already been removed. The chain rested quietly on the pavement beside the pillar, no longer holding anyone in place. Travelers passing through Commercial District 7 slowed their pace for different reasons now. They no longer stared because someone had been abandoned there. They paused because they understood what had happened there. Arya stood beneath the morning light with the old wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She looked toward the delegation waiting patiently several yards away, then back toward Michael. He was already closing the latches on his weathered equipment case. His cargo ship still needed repairs. His unpaid docking fees had not disappeared overnight. His life remained remarkably ordinary despite everything that had happened. That, somehow, made the moment even more meaningful. Arya carefully removed the blanket from her shoulders. She did not rush. She folded it with slow, deliberate movements, smoothing every worn corner and every hand-stitched repair exactly as though she understood how much love had been woven into every thread. When she finished, she stepped toward Michael and held it out with both hands. He accepted it gently, almost reluctantly, as though part of him believed it still belonged with her. "Thank you," Arya said quietly. Michael smiled. "You have already said that." She nodded. "Not for the blanket." He waited. "For reminding me that kindness still exists." Michael looked down at the folded wool resting across his arms. "My mother used to say that people carry warmth farther than blankets ever can." Arya smiled softly. She was wiser than either of us. Behind them, the older delegate watched without interrupting. Even the station workers nearby remained respectfully silent. Some moments belonged only to the people living them. Michael adjusted the strap of his backpack over one shoulder. "I suppose I should finally repair that ship." "I suppose you should," Arya answered with a quiet laugh. It was no longer the uncertain sound of someone afraid to hope. It was genuine. As Michael turned toward the docking corridor, Arya called his name one final time. He looked back. The morning sunlight reflected in her violet eyes as she spoke words he would remember for the rest of his life. "You thought you gave a stranger a blanket," she said. "What you really gave me was the courage to believe that I was still worth seeing." Michael never found the perfect reply. He simply nodded, smiled, and continued walking toward the life waiting for him beyond the station. Months later, travelers crossing Commercial District 7 noticed something standing beside the old steel pillar. It was not a statue of a ruler or a celebrated hero. It was a simple bronze sculpture of a folded blanket resting on a bench. Beneath it, a small metal plaque carried only one sentence: "Compassion begins the moment someone refuses to keep walking." Few visitors knew the names of the engineer or the young alien noblewoman whose lives had crossed beneath that rain. Most never learned them. Yet every day someone paused beside the sculpture before continuing on their journey. Some left flowers. Some left blankets for local shelters. Others simply stopped long enough to notice the people around them. And somewhere among the countless stars, two lives continued along different paths, forever connected by one ordinary act of kindness that quietly reminded an entire civilization what humanity could look like.